here in the stillness. Near me, I sense holy sweetness, calling my soul. Oh, it's restless and running my soul. Oh, it's restless till I find my rest in thee.
I am the Reverend Justin McIntosh. I'm the rector at St. Paul's Church in Ivy, which is a suburb of Charlottesville, and delighted to be with you today, Nick.
Thanks, Justin. So hello, everybody. I'm Father Nick. I'm the priest and pastor of the Fort Church of St. Martin's Parish in Doswell, Virginia. I'm just so happy to be part of this series. I've been enjoying our discussions so much. This series on being Christian in a secular age. Maybe you would like to just say a word of introduction about that, Justin?
Sure. So we're trying to think about the age that we live in. What are some of the assumptions and values and perspectives of this age? We're calling a secular age, following the work of Charles Taylor. And we're looking at not only what this age is like, but how do we, as Christians, make our way through this age? And we're calling this a pilgrimage. How do we journey through this in a sacred, faithful way?
Yeah, I think that image of pilgrimage, as I said in the first video, is so important because we as Christians should always see ourselves, whatever the age, whatever the place we find ourselves in, as in a sense pilgrims, strangers in a strange land, or
Resident aliens.
yeah, I was going to say, use a phrase that draws on a particular book that I think has been formative for both of us, resident aliens. But I like the idea of pilgrims or being on a pilgrimage because it suggests that our sojourn has a destination, and that destination is the kingdom of God, and that's where we are most truly citizens. But that also allows us, I would say, to both appreciate the time in which we live and the places in which we live, and appreciate God's blessings that come to us in our time and in our place, and to step back and be critical of the ways that sin has infected and distorted our time and the place in which we live. Because our hearts are oriented toward the kingdom of God and towards God, and as an extension of that, the love of our neighbors, we can, in fact, be honest and truthful with ourselves and with others about the places that we see distortion, where we see sin, where we see prevarication, and stories that are less helpful, master narratives that don't lend themselves to human flourishing, or might lend themselves to flourishing in one area of human life while suppressing flourishing in other areas of human life, and suppression of some of the good gifts God has given us in other areas of our lives. So I use that as a way of kind of transitioning over to this particular discussion's focus, which is out-narrating the secular stories. Our last video was called Stories of the Secular, and we focused on the master narratives or the meta narratives that help describe, but not just describe, create our secular age.
Right.
And now what we want to do, towards the end of that discussion, we started to look at some of the kind of underlying structures of those stories, which is a nice way of kind of taking a step back, stepping out of those stories for a minute, which we can only do, by the way, because we have another story. We as Christians in particular, though other peoples have other stories too, we have other stories, sometimes called traditions, into which we can step. So I don't want to get too philosophical here, but there's no such thing as a neutral place to stand and make a judgment. That's one of the assumptions of the secular stories, is that the secular is some kind of a value neutral place, a place that has no commitments and is neutral, and a good deal of what's sometimes called postmodern philosophy has critiqued that there is no place to stand outside of stories. When you think you have no myth, that's when you're most enthralled by a myth. And so we as Christians do have a place to stand. We have Christian tradition in which we can step back into, and that allows us to then look at the stories of the secular and to see where they're helpful, because in some places I think they are helpful, though we'll probably focus less on that. And more importantly, perhaps, see the places where they're not helpful, and in particular where perhaps they are creating I don't want to say dishonest, but an untruthful way of viewing history.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that you're pointing out, Nick, that's really so important is that the stakes are high when it comes to master narratives, because they do tell a story about who we are and where we're going. They tell a story about human nature and human flourishing and what it means to actually have a fulfilled life. And depending on what story you accept, that will have implications for how you live your life and the choices you make, and how you think about the purpose of your life. So if we take, say, the story that you laid out in the Christian tradition, where we have a certain telos or end, a purpose to our lives, that defines real flourishing. Well, if we embrace that narrative and that story, that's going to have a profound impact on how we live our daily life if we really internalize that view. Whereas if we think that the reality is that, well, we're all creating our own identities and our own sense of what it means to flourish, our own value systems, right? And to be authentic is to design one for yourself that is in opposition usually to what you've inherited from your family or your culture or something, then you're going to have a very different understanding of human flourishing. And in many ways, this can explain why people live in different ways in our culture even now, is that they have different conceptions of what human flourishing looks like. So these stories are not just stories or historical narratives. They're so much more. They have existential weight to them.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I can't help but kind of cycle back around for a second to this idea that is so important in our secular age of authenticity, which you lifted up, that we have to create our own stories, create our own meaning, imbue the world with meaning that, maybe best summarized in the kind of existentialist perspective, that we're thrown into the world and we have to create meaning for ourselves. We won't find it there. And of course, the presumption here is that the world just is this neutral secular space, right? That this kind of call to authenticity presumes that the world is this neutral secular space that doesn't have value, doesn't have meaning, and we have to apply it, imbue it with that value and that meaning. And this is precisely, I think, one of those places where the Christian story says, no, we're not thrown into this world. We're created into this overarching creation, which is the good creation of a loving God. That God has loved this cosmos into being and has loved you into being. He has desired the existence of all things and has desired your particular existence. And therefore, you can find meaning in the world around you. You can even understand. God has made this universe understandable. Now, this is a very different way of seeing things from we're thrown into this world and we have to make meaning, and we discover, kind of rip open the rattle and discover how it works.
But we might say that that impulse to see ourselves as created beings in a created cosmos is also the engine that has driven scientific discovery and learning in modernity. That idea that there is an order, there is a structure to reality, a lawfulness. Well, why is there that? Well, because it's created, right? It's created by a creator or a mind or a reason. And that underlying kind of foundation is sometimes lost or forgotten when we think about the history of science in the West in modernity.
That's absolutely right. And I hope we can maybe come back to that point
Yes,
at the end of the video. One last thing about this sense of authenticity, because in our first video, we talked about this, the secular age is also an age of authenticity where you have to make your own meaning. And I quoted Stanley Hauerwas in that. And I also mentioned my example then was that any dinner that's cooked for you by someone else tastes better than one you cook for yourself, even if you're a master chef. And I still think that's true, but a better image came to mind recently. My little 7-month-old son has started doing this thing. I don't even know where he picked it up, where he kind of like moves his fingers, and sometimes he'll do it on his face. Sometimes he'll now do the, but I also have seen him pick up his foot and he starts doing it on his foot. I don't know, but I like to tickle his feet, and he just giggles and giggles, and so a part of me wonders, is he trying to tickle his own feet? But you can't do that, right? You can't tickle yourself. Like I don't know why, but you can't. Like and I kind of, that's what I think of when I think of this age of authenticity and trying to make meaning for ourselves.
It doesn't ultimately feel like meaning or significance.
Right. Yeah.
Feels artificial, and because everybody is doing it in their own way, you're left with this sense of, well, what's to say my meaning is better than that person's meaning? Maybe I've understood reality or conceived it in ways that are faulty and wrong, and I should have done it the way my neighbor's done it. You're left with this constant unease, about the way you've constructed things.
That's right. And I would also say that creating a new idea, which I'm not even sure what kind of alchemy produces new ideas, but I believe that it's a far more rare occasion than people pretend, right? I mean, we act like we each have like brand new ideas, creative ideas, all of us all the time. I don't think that's true. Even in PhD programs where they say you have to make a new and original contribution to the field of study through your dissertation. I wonder how many dissertations actually make new and original contributions to their field, given how many dissertations are written in a year. But anyway, this idea that we're creating, in fact, what we're doing is we're appropriating ideas in the tradition of our, in our secular tradition, or in the tradition of the various threads of tradition that make up our secular age. And we just either haven't done the research to know whose idea we're parroting,
Right.
or we've forgotten whose idea we're parroting. I mean, I think that's really, I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard people say things, and in my mind I think, oh, that's Kant, oh, there's Hume, and every
Right.
time, somebody wants to wax philosophical, but they don't name their sources. If you know the history of Western thought well enough, you can usually pick out, who they're thinking, whose words they're using, whose lines of thoughts they're thinking along, even if they don't know that that's what they're doing.
Right.
And that's true for me. I mean, I'm not saying this about other people as opposed to myself,
true
right?
for all.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a fiction that we come up with new ideas and new perspectives. Most of what we think, particularly if it's dealing with philosophical issues or moral issues or things of that nature, these are thoughts that other people have had and probably had them better than you had them, right? But yeah, in a way, every generation has to go through that. I was reading recently, Nick, Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, and that's one point that he makes in the book, which he picks up the line that those who work won't eat, and he says, well, this is obviously not true in the physical world, if you will. In everyday life, lots of people who don't work enjoy the luxuries of the world. But he says when it comes to the spiritual life and the philosophical life, this is true. You can't simply just build on the knowledge of the past. In a sense, you have to experience these ideas yourself. You have to go through them. You have to encounter them, wrestle with them. You have to work, in a sense, to get the payoff. So even as we recycle ideas in the past, we have to process them ourselves. We have to wrestle with them ourselves in our own age and time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right on. So I think maybe a good place for us to really start to struggle with these stories of the secular, I think it might be worthwhile to go through some of the high points of the narrative we laid out in the last video and compare it to the historical evidence and say, does this story really represent the history well? Because we, again, and I'm not saying other people aren't, but we as Christians are concerned with truth because in the Platonic tradition, we associate the transcendentals, truth, beauty, the good, and unicity or oneness with God. And in particular, in John's gospel, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And also the truth shall make you free, and prays that the Holy Spirit will come to sanctify his disciples, to sanctify us in the truth. So truth is important to us. Right. As Christians. And again, that doesn't mean it's not important to other people, but these things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Other people can have other reasons why truth is important.
Pull out just to make this clear from what you're saying, that there is truth, right? In the Platonic scheme, in the Christian understanding, there is a universal truth in God. And it is not the postmodern situation that you mentioned earlier, where the sort of truth as constructed by particular people and particular vantage points and so forth.
Right. What did Richard Rorty say? Something like truth is what your colleagues will let you get away with.
Right.
Which I know that there's more to it than that simple line. But yeah, no, we are, I think the broad and deep tradition of Christian theology and thought is that truth is, I'm going to throw out $3 word is ontological. That it is it has ontic weight or ontological weight. Ontos means being. In a sense, being is another transcendental. Therefore, truth is convertible with, even though we can distinguish it, it's convertible with being itself. So that it's not just a statement about epistemology, another $3 word, about how we know things and whether what we know corresponds to reality. But more than that, it is ontological, that it is what exists. And so, yeah, so we do think that truth is not something we imbue the world with or that we invest things with, but that truth itself is there, whether there would be people to recognize it or not.
In some sense, is the most real
Right.
ontology or being. And our own creation is more of a reflection, or a participation, we might say, or whatever term we want to use, in that ultimate reality.
That's right. And so we're committed to truth, and we're committed, I think, to historical truth. That the historical character of God's revelation, both to Israel as a people in history, and God's revelation in Jesus Christ. So the kind of full disclosure, if not exhaustive, at least full disclosure of God in Jesus Christ. This revelation, who was a historical person.
Right. Right.
That, you know, this commits us to a kind of historical awareness and a sense that we need to be accurate to history. When we tell our stories, we can't play fast and loose with the history. Even as we recognize there's more than just history in truth.
And I think, to add on to that, Nick, I agree 100%. I think we can also, though, approach the work of constructing the historical narrative with humility, in recognizing that, yes, we are tied to historical events, data points, facts, but to something you said earlier, we're still putting those things together and constructing a historical narrative. And we don't want to approach this with the same arrogance, maybe, and smugness that sometimes people, on, say, the atheistic side would create the historical narrative and say, well, this is just the way that it unfolded. What we want to do today is problematize that master narrative that we discussed last time, but also with the humility that we are also creating our story here, right? We're trying to put together the data in the most compelling way, but we can't be 100% certain that we have the perfect story. And I think that's important to just name too.
That's right. Our history is also a story. The history we're going to tell is also a story. The difference is subtle, but I think it's important. What we're saying is we want to be committed to the historical data, but that doesn't change the fact that as we tell a different story, we're going to be lifting up certain things, which means we're not going to be lifting up other things. We're going to be focusing on certain individuals, which means we won't focus on other individuals, certain events, which means other events get downplayed. These are choices that you make when you tell a story. And so, just as you say, Justin, we want to be aware of the fact that we're also telling a story. But before we even do that, I think it's worthwhile to just remind ourselves that the stories that we told, the stories we told in the last video, these stories of the secular, this master narrative, is a story that we find in history books, and this was brought up in our Wednesday night discussion, the kind of history books that kids read in school, this is just history, the kind of surveys of Western civilization you get in an undergrad history class. They're the stories that are told by atheists and new atheists in their books. It's the same kind of story you read in Carl Sagan's This Demon Haunted World, right? And You know, others will also use this. I think you were telling me not long ago, Justin, about where you heard it recently, right?
Yeah, yeah. The former bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Newark, John Shelby Spong, in an interview, I don't know, I think was it CBS or something like that. Anyway, in an interview, he articulated this basic master narrative that we've been talking about.
Religion is always in the control business. And that's something people don't really understand. It's in the guilt-producing control business. And if you have heaven as a place where you're rewarded for your goodness and hell as a place where you're punished for your evil, then you sort of have control of the population. And so they create this fiery place, which has quite literally scared the hell out of a lot of people throughout Christian history. And it's part of a control tactic.
But wait a minute, you're saying that hell, the idea of a place under the earth or somewhere where you're tormented for an eternity, is actually an invention of the church.
I think the church fired its furnaces hotter than anybody else. But I think there's a sense in most religious life of reward and punishment in some form. The church doesn't like for people to grow up, because you can't control grown-ups. That's why we talk about being born again. When you're born again, you're still a child. The people don't need to be born again. They need to grow up. They need to accept their responsibility for themselves and the world.
So you find that narrative even among religious leaders that should potentially have a different way of looking at things, but they don't. And I think that's very fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. It's an incredible thing to hear. I mean, and I know that Bishop Spong is a unique individual in the church, but to hear this kind of story coming from a bishop of the church, and he's convinced that this is the story. This is, you know, this just is history, and that's what we're gonna try and take apart now. And to do that, I think maybe it's worthwhile to revisit the story in its most broad outlines, which I find the best kind of description of it in Atheist Delusions by David Bentley Hart. On page 33 of Atheist Delusions, this is in chapter 3, Faith and Reason. Hence, modernity's first great attempt to define itself, an age of reason, emerging from and overthrowing an age of faith. Behind this definition lay a simple but thoroughly enchanting tale. Once upon a time, it went, Western humanity was the cosseted and incurious ward of Mother Church. During this, the age of faith, culture stagnated, science languished, wars of religion were routinely waged, witches were burned by inquisitors, and Western humanity labored in brutish subjugation to dogma, superstition, and the unholy alliance of church and state. Withering blasts of fanaticism and fideism had long since scorched away the last remnants of classical learning. Inquiry was stifled. The literary remains of classical antiquity had long ago been consigned to the fires of faith, and even the great achievements of Greek science were forgotten till Islamic civilization restored them to the West. All was darkness. Then, in the wake of the wars of religion that had torn Christendom apart, came the full flowering of the Enlightenment, and with it the reign of reason and progress, the riches of scientific achievement and political liberty, and a new and revolutionary sense of human dignity. The secular nation state arose, reduced religion to an establishment of the state, or, in the course of time, to something altogether separate from the state, and thereby rescued Western humanity from the blood-steeped intolerance of religion. Now, at last, Western humanity has left its nonage and attained to its majority in science, politics, and ethics. And he goes on to say, the story of the travails of Galileo most invariably occupies an honored place in this narrative, as exemplary of the natural relation between faith and reason, and as an exquisite epitome of scientific reason's mighty struggle during the early modern period to free itself from the tyranny of religion. And his concluding line in this paragraph: this is, as I say, a simple and enchanting tale, easily followed and utterly captivating in its explanatory tidiness. Its sole defect is that it happens to be false in every identifiable detail.
You gotta love Hart's literary style. Nobody writes like that man.
Well, we recommend this book to you if you want a kind of fuller discussion of what we're about to do now. But in this brief period, let's just take a look at a few of those high points that we mentioned, and talk about them. And maybe a place to start then is the end of antiquity. But before we get to the end of antiquity, it's worthwhile to say that to call the philosophy, even the natural philosophies, if we want to call it that, of the ancient world, science, is really to take science in the way that we mean it today. I should qualify that, is really to take a modern concept and anachronistically project it back into the past. None of the ancient philosophers of Greece and Rome, none of them had any notion of the methodology that we now identify as the scientific method. And it's worthwhile noting, we'll get to this perhaps later in the video, that even the methodology we now identify as scientific method really only gets firmed up and articulated by the philosopher of science Karl Popper in the 20th century. So say someone like Roger Bacon doesn't know the methodology that we now identify as the scientific method, despite the fact that he's seen as the the father of modern science.
You're talking, Nick, right, about falsifiability, which is that a scientific claim or hypothesis needs to be able to be shown false empirically. And if you can't falsify a claim, then it's not a scientific claim. And one of the things Popper was trying to do was to respond to Marxist and Freudian folks who thought that these systems were scientific and spoke of them in scientific terms, and wanted to respond to that. But what's interesting, Nick, is even after Popper, and this is true to today, there's still a lot of debate in philosophy of science about what is science actually? What is it really doing? What is the scientific method? And there are critiques even of Popper's perspective. But you will hear scientists often speak in those ways about science is in the business of falsifying claims about the empirical world.
Yeah, that's right. And again, maybe we can, if it seems appropriate, we can get more into this. Falsifiability is one part of that package. That predictability is another, peer review is another. But maybe of those three, falsifiability is the greatest, to sound a little bit like St. Paul describing virtues.
Greatest of these is falsifiability.
That's right. As you were saying, it's not that hypothesis has to be falsified, but you have to be able to show that the hypothesis you're making can be falsified, that if this data is presented or if these experiments are done, then that would falsify the hypothesis. For me, the great example of this is the board game Clue. because all you do in the board game Clue is keep putting forward hypotheses. You know, it was Colonel Mustard in the kitchen with the wrench or whatever.
Hey, come on, there is only one admitted killer here, and it is certainly not me, it is her.
And then you ask your peers if they can falsify that hypothesis. If someone can, the game continues and you continue to search for the truth. If someone can't falsify it, if you get all the way around the table and nobody who's playing the game can falsify it, and you yourself don't have the cards to falsify it, then of course you present it as a theory. And that's how you, if your theory is correct, you win the game. That's the part that doesn't happen in science, right? You never get to the point where your theory is proven correct. You just get to the point where nobody can falsify it, so it seems like it's worth building on.
The best model for explaining the data and experiments you've had. And I think the point you're drawing out here is that in the modern scientific method, the claims have to be precise. There has to be a certain precision to them so that you can't simply modify the hypothesis if the data doesn't quite fit it. Although this sort of happens, doesn't it? People,
it happens all the time.
Time, right? They their hypothesis is sort of falsified, and they say, "Well, actually, let me rework the hypothesis," and then it's.
and when you get to the kind of the grand scale, you talk to a physicist who's doing cosmology, and so they're looking at the kind of length and breadth and depth of the universe. You know, how do you even falsify some of the claims that are out there? This is the problem with string theory. This is the problem with the multiverse and many worlds. Even to some extent, a problem with inflation. How do you falsify these things? But in the end, there's no way to falsify it.
Right.
In this case, it's just, does this model work well enough with the data that it's worthwhile still using? And that's why someone like the physicist and cosmologist Sean Carroll says, you know, in the science that I'm doing, falsifiability doesn't really come in. So maybe it's time to retire that concept, at least in his level of science. But then with science?
Right, exactly. And I would say that any metaphysics that's well thought out, that is to say, any worldview that you have or perspective, is going to hopefully be a good model that makes sense of the whole package of data. But we wouldn't necessarily call that science. We might call it philosophy, but not science. And we all have that, right? We all have a philosophical outlook that tries to explain the whole package of data.
That's right. Well, all of that's to say, none of these ancient Greek and Roman philosophers were having these conversations. They had not read Popper, we're fairly certain.
Yes.
And so they didn't know about falsifiable hypotheses. So, you know, again, it's anachronistic to use the word science, and it doesn't serve any purpose except to bolster a contemporary position. It doesn't actually help you understand them in their historical context. That said, let's move specifically to the story of the Library of Alexandria and the death of Hypatia. And I don't want to spend too much time here. David Bentley Hart in Atheist Delusions does a good job of dealing with the history here. And Justin, feel free to jump in at any point. But essentially, there have been multiple destructions of the library in Alexandria, some before Jesus ever lived. And there's no one destruction of the library that is explicitly tied to Christians. Hypatia, who we mentioned in the last video, this pagan philosopher who was engaged in mathematics, because you can speak of ancient mathematicians. They were, you know, these ancient philosophers were doing mathematics. She was murdered by a group of a kind of lay fraternal order of Christians. So that's true. But this is not seen as something that later Christians, or even Christians at the time, were proud of, but something that other Christians felt was reprehensible and condemned. And the reason why she was murdered has nothing to do with, as far as we know, with her gender, or even with her paganism per se, certainly not her philosophy, her mathematics, her teaching, but she got embroiled in a political dispute between the governor and the bishop, Cyril of Alexandria, who himself was not a great guy, I'll admit. And these folks thought that they would take the matter into their own hands. But again, they were condemned, and Hypatia, most of what we know about Hypatia was recorded by and preserved by Christians who respected her. And again, I would just direct people to David Bentley Hart's book, where he kind of unpacks this a little bit more and goes into more depth and detail.
It's not the case that these early Christian thinkers, theologians in the patristic period, the first couple hundred years, and we'll look at probably the greatest of them, Augustine, in a few moments, I think. It's not the case that they were, for the most part, anti-Greco-Roman philosophy, right? That they were opposed to the pagan intellectual tradition. They were trying, in many cases, to draw out the wisdom, to draw out the truth from these traditions. I think of someone like Justin Martyr, for instance, in the 2nd century, who very much respected people like Socrates and Plato and wanted to draw out from them what you could that was true about the world. Again, coming back to that point you made earlier, Nick, that there is a truth here, and Christianity is concerned with the truth. So this wasn't a case of simply Christians saying, well, everything that's come before us is all bad and awful and terrible, and we're going to expunge it and suppress it. No, it was actually incorporated very much into Christianity.
That's right. That's absolutely right. I mean, that's one of the things, that gets Augustine to convert to Christianity. He had been raised in Tagaste in northern Africa by a Christian mother and a pagan father. He rejected his mother's Christianity. As a young man, he connected himself with a group called the Manichaeis, this religious movement known as Manichaeism, which was a very syncretistic kind of movement. It saw Jesus as a prophet, and it saw Buddha as a prophet, and saw as the greatest prophet their own prophet Mani. And Augustine was very kind of enthralled by this religious movement. He never quite joined as a member, but he was, I forget their language, and it might have been the same. I'll just use the Christian language. He was, you might say, a catechumen. He was learning about them. But he had all sorts of questions because he was an educated guy. He was being educated in his youth, and he was a brilliant, young man, and a brilliant man. And so he had all sorts of questions, and he found that they couldn't answer them. And they kept saying, well, we've got this bishop who is fantastic orator, who's our bishop. His name's Faustus. Just wait till Faustus comes. You can ask him all your questions. Augustine finally does meet Faustus, and he tells us in the Confessions that he thought Faustus was a nice guy, a great guy, good orator. He could really make a good speech or give a good sermon. But he said there wasn't much substance. And when he came to Faustus, this Manichaean bishop, with his questions, Faustus didn't have the answers. I know that we now live in a time where we like to say the questions are more important than the answers, but questions are only meaningful if there's at least the promise, the hope of having some kind of answer. Otherwise, if you have no hope of an answer, if there's no promise of an answer, at least some kind of answer, even if it's incomplete, then you have nothing to do with the question other than to put it aside and preoccupy yourself with something else. And Augustine wanted truth. He wanted to find the answers to his questions. Well, he moves to to Rome and then to Milan to kind of chase dreams of success in his work and fame and wealth. And while in Milan, he meets the Bishop of Milan, the Christian Bishop of Milan, who we know as Saint Ambrose. And this encounter was extraordinarily important for him. It wasn't the final thing that makes him convert, but he's able to have a conversation with the Bishop of Milan, with Ambrose, and Ambrose is well versed in not just Christian learning, not just the scriptures, but in pagan learning. He is one of the most well-read and well-versed and educated and thoughtful people Augustine has ever met. And
Do
that,
you remember in the Confessions, Augustine's remark about how Ambrose could read silently? And this was just such a remarkable thing. Most people, when they read at the time, would read out loud. And in part, that's because you didn't have punctuation and it would have been very difficult to decipher without speaking out loud. But this was one of Ambrose's great talents, just as a little anecdote to highlight how learned he was.
right, and how different our age is from.
Yes, yeah.
But the point that I'm trying to make here is that it was the fact that Ambrose knew, the philosophy and the learning, not just of Christians but of pagans of his own day, that was so impressive to Augustine. And it's worthwhile now kind of turning and looking at Augustine, because I mentioned that he is often held up as sometimes this villain of the story, because he kind of sets the stage for medieval theology and therefore the kind of darkness of the Dark Ages.
And would it be fair that his villainy is kind of associated with maybe two basic ideas? One is that he's anti-body, anti the physical, repressing the natural human urges, and people focus especially on his views around sexuality and so forth. But then also, I think most especially his conception of original sin, right? And what that says about human nature. And in the secular master narrative, this is seen as a kind of suppression or enslavement or almost blemishing, if you will, of humanity and human nature that we have to overcome later when we get to the Renaissance. Do you want to speak to those two things, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's right on. I mean, that's what he's often remembered for, is the being anti-sexuality and this idea of original sin that somehow bodily, and therefore we should hate our bodies because we kind of receive this stain of original sin like a sexually transmitted disease, and it's carried in our bodies and such. Well, these are just not true. I mean, it's amazing to me how often I hear these, and it's incredible because it's so not true. So in terms of sexuality, one thing that we do see that's unique to early Christianity before Augustine is the prizing and the honoring of celibacy. This we see is, I mean, in the New Testament itself.
Paul's letters, yeah.
Right. Paul says that it would be better if you remained unmarried and celibate like I am. He says that in 1 Corinthians. Jesus says there will be those who will make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God. And what we see in Christian history is that this becomes, especially for women, a pathway out of their role as essentially baby making machines.
And the associated physical danger of being a baby making machine in
Right.
the ancient world. We forget that mortality rates for mothers the rates were extremely high, and for many women it was liberating to not get caught into that that cycle of giving birth and getting pregnant and giving birth, because eventually you're probably going to die in the process of childbirth.
Right. That's absolutely right. Peter Brown and Society and the Body is that's probably the best study of this in the ancient world. But we see it's stories of Saint Thecla, who is not mentioned in the New Testament, but there are all sorts of stories about her extra canonically that were written in the 2nd century. Saint Thecla apparently worked with Saint Paul, and she was a woman who, at least in the stories, was going to be, she was pagan, she was betrothed, she was about to be married. She hears Paul proclaim the gospel, and she renounces her betrothed and seeks out Paul to be baptized. And actually it's a little bit in the stories, it's funny because Paul says, well, no, I don't want to upset your father and your husband to be, I'm not going to baptize you, which I can't imagine the historical Paul saying to anybody, I'm not going to baptize you. But that's how the story goes in the 2nd century, reflecting on the 1st. And so she like keeps hounding him, you got to baptize me, you got to finally she baptizes herself. And she gets so fed up with him, but she baptizes herself and she leads a life of celibacy by her choice. Right. And we see that again and again in the ancient world. You see it with, I believe, now I'm going to show my ignorance, I believe Saint Macrina remained celibate. She was either remained celibate all of her life or she was widowed and then remained celibate. But she becomes the great teacher of the Cappadocian Fathers. And she's able to do this because by taking on the celibate life, she has now the time to live a life of prayer and study and becomes a great teacher of the faith.
And Nick, isn't it the case that even among some pagan philosophical schools, celibacy was prized for precisely the reasons you're talking about here, that it gives you that ability to focus on truth or wisdom and on your pilgrim progress towards that, if you will, and not to get enmeshed in all of the challenges of family life and so forth.
That's absolutely right. And it wasn't as often within the Christian community, but there were pagan women philosophers like Hypatia. Hypatia herself refused to marry. She lived the celibate life because she was focused on the higher things. And so this way of life, and you mentioned this kind of, Justin, in our first video, becomes the Christian ideal. Monks and the kind of precursors of monks, really, but eventually monks and what we would now call nuns, those who have taken vows of celibacy, became the ideal. This is how Christians should live. And you see someone like Pelagius, whose teachings get condemned as heresy, and there's a whole cult of Pelagius now that want to kind of revive him as this great kind of Christian thinker who's been maligned by the church. He's one of the people who says you can only be a real, true Christian if you live a celibate life.
Right.
If you're willing to take on these ascesis, these disciplines, this ascesis, these disciplines, these exercises to perfect yourself. Right. And Augustine comes along and says, no, that's not right. God does call certain people, some people, to the celibate life. And Augustine felt that God, in fact, called him to the celibate life. But God gives those people grace to live it out. Right. And God calls other people to the married life, and God gives them grace to live out their covenant of marriage. And one is not greater than the other. Now that's what Augustine says in a Christian world that is saying celibacy is the more perfect way of the Christian. So he actually holds up sexual relationship as being on equal status with that.
Oh, okay. Okay. So in a way, we could say then, Nick, that Augustine was maybe more affirming of that aspect of human life, the sexual life, than a lot of his contemporaries in the Christian world and even in the Greco-Roman world.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
What about original sin?
Yeah. No, I was going to say, so you might say, well, what about this thing about catching original sin like it's an STD? Isn't that what he said? Again, this is taking a view that belonged to someone else that Augustine actually argued against and applying it to Augustine. And this is the view that's held by a Christian thinker, not a church father technically, but a Christian thinker named Tertullian in northern Africa, who predated Augustine, had a huge impact on Christianity in northern Africa. So Augustine was always kind of having to respond to and struggle with Tertullian's thoughts. Tertullian, like some other Christians of his day, and like the philosophers known as the Stoics, was a materialist. He believed that all things were material, but you had different layers or levels of materiality. The Manichaeans also believed this too. So the soul was a material thing. Now it's a subtle substance, more fine, more thin than even smoke. But it's still a material substance. That's what Tertullian believed. He also believed that about God. God also was a material substance. And the soul was made of a similar kind of ethereal substance as God was, but it's still a material substance. We might think of it today as being like energy, perhaps. And so for Tertullian, when a married couple got together and had a child, this means that I don't want to go into details here, but a part of the man's soul goes into the woman and is united with the more base or heavier material that the woman provides, which becomes the body. And so you have two types of matter coming together: this ethereal matter of the father's soul and the heavier earthy matter of the mother, and the two coming together are body and soul, the body coming from the mother, the soul coming from the father. And therefore his understanding of original sin, because he was talking about it long before Augustine was ever born, was that this sin is carried in the soul of the father, and whenever the father's soul passes into the child, they carry with it this original sin. So this really is the original sin as a kind of STD. I mean, that's really kind of his view. Augustine heard this, and he didn't know of any other conception of, no pun intended, of this of this, how original sin is to be understood. And so he just kind of accepted it for a while until he had time to work it out. He actually wrote to Saint Jerome about this and said, well, this doesn't sound right, but help me understand this. Right. What's going on? And Jerome, anyone who's read Saint Jerome knows that the man was brilliant when it came to translating, but not a great theologian. So Jerome didn't know what to do with it, and he just basically said, "Well, don't bother me." He was a little dismissive to Augustine. It's one of these funny things, because Augustine kind of idolized Jerome, and Jerome was like, "Oh, who is this guy?" And now, of course, Augustine's had way more of an impact on the church than Jerome ever had. But anyway, towards the end of his life, Augustine was able to work out a different view, and he rejected Tertullian's view known as Traducianism. because Augustine realized that the soul, like God, is not material in any way. And therefore it can't be the bearer of original sin in this kind of STD-like sense, because it's not a piece of the father's soul that then forms into the child. And so he rejects this view, and has he develops what we might call a more Neoplatonic view, which we don't need to get into. The important thing here is that he actually rejects this negative view of souls and bodies that he receives from Tertullian. And it's because of Augustine's rejection of Traducianism that the church in a later council rejected Traducianism. So it's never been the teaching of the church that original sin is like an STD that's passed down bodily from parents to children. Well, we need to leave Augustine behind and get into the Dark Ages and see if they were really so dark.
How dark were they, Nick? Was there any light at all in the Dark Ages?
Yeah, there was tons. So if you don't accept this idea of stages, then you might just see the medieval period not as a Middle Ages or a Dark Ages, but as just a continuation of some of the learning some of the knowledge that was held in antiquity. There were some important upheavals in political arrangements, what we call the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, and that had an impact. As the barbarian tribes came down from the Germanic tribes that the Romans considered barbarians, came down from Northern Europe into Italy, into other parts of the Roman Empire. There was a kind of I feel like fall is too big of a word, but there's a change in the structure of governance, and
There's a kind of separating of the societal structure, a deconstruction, and maybe one way we can put it is that cities and urban life, which had been so important in the Roman Empire, faded away, and were abandoned in many cases. Some of these cities, and agricultural life became kind of central. So we can say, I think, reasonably that there was a decline in some of the learning and knowledge that was widely available prior to this period in those first couple centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, we're just talking here about the West. It's always important to make that qualification. For instance, about Boethius in the 500s, who was probably one of the most educated people in all of Europe because he still had knowledge of the Greek classics and so forth. But there were fewer and fewer people like that as time went on during that early period. But we want to be very clear, I think, right, that was that early period especially. And sometimes people will refer to this as the Dark Ages, but scholars generally now want to call this the early Middle Ages. And it's a time in which you have much more decentralization.
That's right.
A lot of that infrastructure that you had in the Roman Empire.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And reading Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy is this is considered a medieval text,
right.
A text from the Dark Ages, right? But go and read it, and I mean, it reads like anything from one of the philosophers of antiquity. Right. So I think your kind of description, Justin, was really, really good. What happens is a lot of these barbarian tribes or Germanic tribes don't have literacy, and so it's always been the case literacy was never as widespread in the ancient world or the medieval world or even the early modern world as it is now. And we have to remember that even in the height of the Roman Empire, you might have had about 10% literacy, right? And it was centered in these cities. The peasants in the hinterlands, the Pagani, which is where we get the word pagan from, were always illiterate, typically. Or they had just the most basic functional kind of literacy, which was a literacy, by the way, of reading. Even within we put reading and writing together as if they go, you learn both at the same time, because that's the way we teach them. But actually, for most of the history of the world, writing was an even more specialized skill. Just because you knew how to read didn't mean that you knew how to write. There's stories of Charlemagne who he could read, and he could even read some Latin, which he really wanted to do, but he never quite got the hang of writing.
Yeah, supposedly he practiced writing out his name at night. He had a writing utensil and some sort of tablet of some kind that he wrote on, and he tried to figure out how to write his name, and he practiced that every night. And jumping ahead, maybe if we can, to Charlemagne, that's kind of a good turning point, isn't it? Of the emergence of a kind of renaissance, maybe, of learning in Charlemagne's court, which really hits its stride in Western Europe in what's known as the High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1300, roughly in that period.
Yeah, isn't it even called? I mean, it's not. We always just think of the Renaissance, but I'm pretty sure, isn't it called the Carolingian Renaissance?
It is exactly, yes, yeah, that's exactly right. Now, Nick, I think in the High Middle Ages, if we can press a little bit ahead on that, many people don't realize, but that was the period in which universities were founded. Not exactly the same as modern universities, but the foundation for what we have today in modern universities. It was a time of tremendous learning, right? And scholarship. But that's very different than the Dark Ages.
Right.
So
right.
what was going on in the universities? What were they learning there?
Yeah, well, so one thing that's important to remember is that as the infrastructure of the Roman Empire did in the Western Empire started to collapse, the people who were the most learned, the people who were literate, were the bishops, and so they naturally had to step into the vacuum and take some kind of political role. And we can come back to that perhaps a little bit later. But the monasteries also became these great centers of preserving knowledge, which was difficult at that time. Scrolls and codices or books it was expensive to copy these, to maintain these. And yet you had whole monasteries that were just dedicated to doing this work, and not just copying Bibles, but whatever bits of ancient texts they could get their hands on, they would copy and preserve. So you had monasteries as places of learning, and then also the great cathedrals of the High Middle Ages had cathedral schools, which became places of learning. But as you say, Justin, beginning in Italy in the 11th century, we see the first universities being birthed by these monasteries and cathedral schools as freestanding institutions. And of course, it's, the date, I believe the date of Oxford's founding is usually cited as 1096, the oldest university in England, right in the midst of the High Middle Ages. We have these universities coming into being. You would go there to study divinity, which means theology, of course, but also philosophy. These two were seen as kind of going hand in hand. So philosophy meaning metaphysics and ethics.
And in some ways, this was, right, the queen of the sciences. It was like divinity was where you ended up after you went through a lot of other formation.
Right.
So it wasn't just divinity, but that was considered sort of the climax or the culmination of your studies.
Right. And so the liberal arts would be, if you weren't going to, go all the way through that education and end up learning theology, you would at least learn the liberal arts, as they were called. This is a designation going all the way back to the ancient world that was preserved by the medieval church. And this had two parts: the trivium, which were logic, rhetoric, and grammar, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. In addition to these, certain universities became known for being places of medicinal or learning the art of medicine, using the ancient texts of Hippocrates and of Galen. So the University of Bologna became a place known as where you would go to study the law.
Right.
As you mentioned on Wednesday night, Justin, I mean, in some ways, the education for those who could afford to be educated, which was a small, it was a small elite group. It's not, they had nothing like public education like we have now. But that education was in some ways better than our education. Broader and yet in some ways also deeper than our own public education now.
And Nick, I mean, if we were to turn to probably the greatest theologian, philosopher of the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas, and we were to read his Summa Theologica, for instance, we would see that his style, known as the scholastic style, was extremely logical, extremely rational, laid out particular ideas and then responses to that, particular claims, responses to that, and responses to the responses. And this is not this is not a irrational or anti-intellectual person in any way, but somebody steeped in logic, steeped in philosophy, trying to find coherence and rationality and order to all different sorts of concepts. Yes, operating in a Christian world, right? That's part of the social imaginary, but somebody who cares about rationality and order and a system, right? Systematizing all of this. This is a society that constructed some of the most impressive architectural accomplishments that took a whole lot of rationality and thought to construct. I'm thinking here of cathedrals. One doesn't simply build a cathedral.
Geometry, mathematics, absolutely. I mean,
Right.
these things didn't just happen like putting together Legos or building blocks. I mean,
so we're not just talking about a bunch of uneducated, superstitious, witch-killing peasants running around the fields of France, right? That certainly by the time we get to the High Middle Ages, we have a flowering of intellectual life in Western Europe, a flowering that is drawing from new sources through Islamic interpreters and translators. And that's another interesting feature, that this is a kind of multicultural society to some degree. These people are aware of certainly Middle Eastern culture through the Crusades and through trade and other means. And they're drawing from that, right? And incorporating, again, truth wherever they can find it on that quest to understand the world at a deeper way. These are not superstitious people in that sense.
That's right. I mean, and just a couple quick things to add on to that. I mean, one is that, in fact, you don't find very much evidence at all of say witch burnings and in the medieval world. In fact, most of our historical accounts of persecution, hangings, whatever, burnings of witches comes from the early modern period. Not just the Salem witch trials, but in the 17th century and the 16th, 17th century, there's witch trials happening in Scotland and in England. And again, that's in the early modern period. That's in the period we typically call the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and that kind of stuff. What we don't see is that kind of stuff happening in the medieval period. Another important point is, as you mentioned, that the Islamic influence, we often forget, I think, maybe you don't, maybe you all who are watching don't forget this, but I think it's easy to forget that through a large period of time within the medieval period, Spain was Al-Andalus. It was part. It was under Islamic control, and a lot of Middle Eastern, what we might call Arabic culture, but not just Arabic culture, Northern African culture, all of that's coming into Europe through Spain. And there's this great interactions there, not all of it hostile. And there was a period of, we might call Islamic Renaissance, where they're dealing with, many Islamic thinkers are dealing with these ancient texts that they're translating into Arabic, that they've gotten a hold of. What's often left out of that story is that they've gotten these texts many times from the Christians in Jerusalem and in Damascus, who had maintained ancient schools and libraries there. And so when Islam came to those areas, the Christian scholars, theologians were interacting with Islamic scholars and theologians, trading these texts back and forth. So many of those ideas were coming because Christians in the Middle East had preserved those ideas and those texts. And then they make their way up into Europe through Islam's presence in Spain. So, there's lots of interactions. I think one of the great examples of this is Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal, his story of the Holy Grail. We all think of the Holy Grail as a chalice, but that's a kind of later development. The Grail has been many different things in these medieval romances, and in Wolfram von Eschenbach's, it's a stone that has come down from heaven and is housed in a special building. It was brought by the neutral angels in the war in heaven, those angels who refused to take a side, brought this stone down from heaven. And this is the Grail. And there's other aspects that I could go into, but essentially what Eschenbach is doing is saying, look, maybe the Muslims aren't our enemies. And maybe the Grail is what they've got in the Kaaba. And, and this is what can unite us. Right? Yeah. He's actually telling a story that unites, and we see this directly with Parsifal and his half-brother Philophus, who is a Muslim warrior. And the two of them almost come to blows until they realize that they're actually brothers. And then they reconcile. Yeah. This is coming from a Christian knight who's writing this in the medieval period, trying to negotiate some kind of peace, but more than just tolerance, an actual kind of coming together, saying that maybe what brings us together is more important than what divides us. Anyway, just not the kind of thing you typically think of when you think of the Dark Ages or the medieval period.
There certainly was violence, there certainly was conflict. We could go through the Crusades in all of their bumbling silliness. Of course, there was intra-Christian fighting in the Crusades too, between Westerners and people in the Eastern Roman Empire. But you're, I think, helpfully pointing out that it's more complex than just a simple narrative, right? And as you said, in Al-Andalus as well, you had Jews and Christians and Muslims together in that society. Not equal in the way that we're thinking about people today in Western societies, but finding a way to work together and learn from each other and so forth. And I think that, that's the reality. It's more complex.
That's right. Thomas Aquinas was reading Maimonides, a Jewish thinker, and he's reading Averroes and Ibn Sina, Islamic theologians, for their to help, have them help him think about Aristotle, who's a pagan thinker from antiquity. And so, again, there's much more diversity and much more communication there, and much more learning going in, involved and going on than we tend to think. That plurality of religions, I think it's important to note, because when we discuss the age of discovery or the age of exploration, we act as if Christians had never come across other religious traditions before until that time, until Columbus is sailing the ocean blue or something. When in fact Christians had not only encountered the pagans of Rome, the pagans of of Northern Europe, but also had encounters with the Manichaeis and with Islam and with Judaism all through the medieval period. So Christianity has always, in a sense, existed in a plurality of religious traditions and has always been aware of that plurality. Now, maybe not your average serf in England, but the intellectual elite, the scholars, the theologians, the kings and queens,
The
they're
culture makers, in some
I'm
ways,
sorry?
the culture makers of their
Right.
society.
Yeah. I think the difference that someone like Taylor might point out is that in our day, you can walk down your street and meet people of various beliefs and traditions, and that might not be so true in the medieval period.
Sure, right.
But that, but it's not as if they had to go out and sail around the world to meet people and realize there were other religious traditions.
Right.
So one of the things that we see during this medieval period is that the church is not only a bastion of learning, it's a place that gives birth to cathedral schools and to universities, and stores up and transmits or hands down the accumulated knowledge and wisdom in the form of texts being preserved and copied in monasteries.
Yeah.
But the church does take on a kind of political role, which we've already, I think, mentioned a little bit of, as the cities as centers of political organization in the
Right.
Roman Empire begin to be abandoned in some sense,
Right.
and we see that infrastructure of the Western Roman Empire kind of dissolve as new political formations emerge. It's precisely because the church is a place of learning, and because the leaders of the church, the bishops, and to a lesser degree the priests, it's because they are, and the monks, of course, because they are the educated, they begin to have a role in maintaining some kind of societal and political infrastructure.
Right.
And so we see that more and more bishops are expected to take on the roles that Roman governors and magistrates had once held, up in Italy, but also up into Northern Europe, places where the Roman Empire pulled back from. For example, in the British Isles, where the Roman Empire had extended as far as Hadrian's Wall, so not up into what we would now call Scotland, which is where the Picts were, and not over into Ireland, which is where the Scots were, to be entirely confusing. But down among the Celtic Brits and the Angles and the Saxons who are coming in, Rome withdrew from that area, and it was the church that had been, that had followed the Roman roads out to to those areas, that both preserved knowledge but also provided some kind of social and political infrastructure.
Way, in a sense, there was a kind of necessity for ecclesiastical leadership to also take on significant political and social administrative roles in their society um, as life became more agrarian and small towns and villages and less of kind of the urban development that we saw in late antiquity.
That's right. One of the interesting things to do is to compare the Western Church, which began to operate using Latin as its primary language, which, by the way, was really important, that all of these areas all across Europe would be united by a language. It's actually how education was able to be built up and sustained.
Right.
That there was one language across these areas for the educated. But if you compare the Latin West with the Eastern Church and the Eastern Empire, which maintained Greek as its lingua franca, because there was such a strong civil government apart from the church in the Eastern Empire, the church became a kind of, not quite a vassal, but certainly a support to, and got kind of folded into the structure of the civil state of the Eastern Empire. And to such a degree that that relationship is now known as Caesaropapism. And what you see in the West is that there's, from about the time of, well, even the time of St. Augustine's mentor, Bishop Ambrose, St. Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, there's a tension, in fact, between the church and the civil authorities, even though the civil authorities are Christian. There's tension between the two, and not this simple relationship of the church supporting and doing whatever the government says. And so this is a part of the story I think that often gets overlooked, is that in the West, in the Latin West, there's often a struggle between the church and kings and the queens, the princes, the Holy Roman Emperor, for that matter, may be crowned by the Bishop of Rome, by the Pope, but that doesn't mean that they're always working together. And in fact, the church was often holding the civil authorities accountable.
Right. Well, and your comment also makes me think about how the church in the Middle Ages sought to rein in the behavior of knights and lords, who often gave in to the inclination to war with each other and fight and steal and so forth. And the church tried to develop, I think it was the Peace and Truce movement or something along those lines, to develop restrictions on how knights could fight with each other. And eventually the chivalric codes will also kind of function in that way too. But before those really take off, the church is there trying to change the culture in some sense, or to reform it. And so that tension you're talking about is also going on culturally, as well as administratively or governmentally.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about the Crusades, which the church is always kind of criticized for the Crusades, the Crusades were led by the kings and the princes. The church did give its stamp of approval, at least to the early Crusades, the purpose of which was to secure safe passageway for pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. And the idea was that here is a common cause for the good of pilgrims who have no way to protect themselves, that we can encourage these knights in this essentially warrior culture,
Right.
encourage these knights to focus on doing good in this way and
Right.
protecting the innocent, rather than always being at war with each other,
Right. Right.
which was often disastrous, less for the knights than for the peasants who would get caught
Right.
in it.
Yeah. Right. Right.
That's not to exonerate the church in
Right.
some
Right.
sense. It's not to say that any kind of warfare is good. I myself am a Christological pacifist, which we don't need to get into. It's important to understand this change in the culture, as you
Yeah.
were mentioning,
Yeah.
that the church is trying to bring about. That it's trying to bring about a more just, but also a more peaceful society.
I mean, and there is certainly, there's a whole system about sacramental penance and so forth that plays into how the Crusades were understood by the church. But I think at the simplest level, we can simply say that there were many reasons why people went on crusades, some maybe more noble than others. And it's certainly the case that there were abuses of various kinds and violence of various kinds that we would look upon today in a negative way. But I think it's important for what you were saying. I think it's important to emphasize that you do have very much a warrior culture here, and the church is trying to channel that warrior culture in productive ways, socially beneficial ways.
Absolutely. And we could say something similar about the Inquisition. I mean, everybody mentions the Spanish Inquisition, which nobody expects. And
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
and
I got the joke, Nick. I got the joke.
what people often fail to understand is that the Inquisition was conducted by the Spanish government, not by the church. Now it certainly employed priests and especially Dominicans to help with this, but this was not primarily or principally an endeavor of the church. This was an endeavor of the Spanish government because, as we had mentioned earlier, Spain particularly had been a place of the mixing of Christians with Jews and with Muslims in a unique way in Europe and medieval Europe that left the Christian rulers, after the retreat of the Islamic forces, left them feeling vulnerable. And so they particularly felt like they needed to secure their power. The church went along with that,
Right.
but I think it's worthwhile to note that it wasn't, in fact, something that the church had set out to do.
Yeah, sometimes people too imagine that the church invented all of these horrific devices of torture, and this is of course not the case either. Torture was sometimes involved in the Inquisition, but these were practices that were widespread in the society. It is not as though the church developed something nefarious that nobody else had. And I think it's worth mentioning two other things. I mean, one, that the Dominicans would have seen resorting to things like torture as a failure, basically. I mean, their goal was to get people to recant what they were involved in, whatever heretical movement. They did not want, in that sense, to sadistically inflict pain on people. And then lastly, I think we have to think about what does it mean to talk about heresy in this context, right? You have a theological notion of the body of Christ, and these views, whatever the views might be, and there were different heretical movements that flourished in this time, were seen as threatening kind of the health of the body. With you could use almost a medical analogy, right? Like it was sort of a cancer on the body, and if you let this thing continue to spread, it would undermine the society. And I suppose that's not so hard for us to imagine. I mean, there are certain ideas that we deem unacceptable, right? that we don't let just flourish in our society, and we have ways of tamping them down. We do it in other ways than the Inquisition, of course, but let's say that people are holding openly racist views, right? We find ways of marginalizing the Ku Klux Klan, protecting the body politic from that. And that is the same basic concept. Again, different methods, different concerns, but the idea of there are things that are dangerous to the common good.
That's right. And I mean, one difference that is not related to the church particularly, but just a difference between that time and our time,
Right.
is the notion of a penal system with mass incarceration.
Right.
That's the way we deal with things, right? We have mass incarceration.
Right.
We have more people jailed than any society
Right.
in history,
Right.
because that's the way we deal with it. Remove them from society. And we won't, I don't think, get into this now, but Taylor does a little bit get into how that plays into a kind of secular notion of how you create the perfect secular society, and what the purpose of imprisonment is. But in the medieval world, there wasn't a sense of well, let's put all of these people who are doing something against the common good or the commonweal, let's put them all in some kind of prison. Prisons were basically used as waiting places for execution of folks who were accused of treason or whatever. You think of the Tower of London in the medieval world, or they were debtors' prisons. And that was essentially the use of prisons back then. It's a very different mindset to the way we think, in which case we tend to think that we should put people in prison and then rehabilitate them so that they can go back into society. Of course, then we often charge people and lay down so many years of time of imprisonment for rehabilitation that it ends up that they don't get out, or when they do get out, they're so accustomed to life in
we
prison.
mark them, don't we? We mark them as outcasts too, and make it very difficult for people to actually reintegrate into society. But along the point you're making, along the lines of what you're saying, look at the word penitential, right? The penitential system, the word we use, it has resonances with the whole idea, the Christian idea of repentance and new life and turning. So in a way, the sacramental system of the church, which did not involve, of course, putting people in prison, as you just said, gets taken over and transferred into this new format, which involves putting those people away somewhere. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, Nick, that had something to do with the Quakers and the idea of being in stillness and silence. And if you were separated out, you would have time to think about what you had done and, listen for the working of the Holy Spirit and then turn your life around. But you can see it's almost like a new religion, right? That's been formed to deal with sin, to deal with human misdeeds.
I mean, in a sense, it's taking purgatory out of the afterlife. And
Right. Yeah.
You're gonna do your penance now.
That's right.
Than after you die. Well, let's kind of move away from that. I think the main point there is just that there's a much more complex relationship between church and state, and the Western Latin culture of the medieval period, because of this forcing of the bishops to take on leadership and infrastructure roles. And the movie to watch, I mean, there's more than one, but the movie to watch to really kind of get a sense of this is Becket, an older movie about the saint Thomas Becket, who is so important to the history and story of Canterbury and therefore in a way to Anglicanism. But let's move on from that and just say a little bit about the age of discovery, or the age of exploration. And I want to be really quick with this. We mentioned this in our last video, but no educated person in the medieval world, as far as we know, believed that the earth was flat and that you would sail off the edge of it, if you went too far.
So you mean Columbus didn't discover that, Nick?
That's right. So I would hazard the guess that there are more flat earthers now, more educated people who believe we live on a flat earth now than there were in the medieval period. Maybe
Well, that's because they didn't have Facebook in the Middle Ages and Twitter and all these social media platforms. That's the reason.
Well, but also there's an interesting thing about this that I'll bring up just really quickly, which is that the flat Earth proponents now think that they are being particularly scientific because they say you should not accept what is simply told to you in textbooks or by experts, but you should use your own empirical senses, your sight, your smell, your taste, your touch, your hearing. You should use your own empirical senses to observe the world and make decisions about its nature. And they see that as essentially scientific. Though we've talked a little bit about scientific methodology and how that's not really scientific methodology, but that's what they think they're doing, in line with what might really be seen as a kind of 17th and 18th century natural philosophy. And they say, well, you walk outside and you look around and the earth looks flat, doesn't it? So it's actually this narrative of science that they're trying to hook onto that leads them to make these decisions, these flat earth decisions that people in the Middle Ages wouldn't have held. Go ahead.
Right. And I was just saying, in our discourse in modernity, people are always appealing to science in one way or another, because that's kind of seen as an authority for settling questions. So you see this with the flat earthers, but you see this also with creationists, right? And they are almost trying to adopt a scientific approach to questions of biology and human development and so forth, or couching what they're saying in kind of scientific terms. And I would say you see this with the debate we're having right now in our society about vaccinations, right? People will go online and they'll read an article and they'll pull some data points here and there. And of course, it's all about how you put those data points together and sort of a coherent analysis of it. But you can see the impulse is the same, to try to marshal empirical facts about why the vaccines aren't safe or whatever. And so this sort of scientific language that we have to couch everything in is an interesting feature of modernity, and it kind of shows where we see real authority, right?
Right.
Where we place.
Yeah. So authority, this is the language of authority. And there's this kind of assumption that it's value free, it's neutral. So if you just have the right data, then you've got the right position.
Right.
And when, as you're pointing out, is not the case. The data always needs to be interpreted, always needs to be set within a narrative, within a story. And that's going to determine because you can't actually just take in all the data, right? That's going to determine what data you're going to privilege, what data you're going to focus on. And, all of that is nestled within some kind of narrative. So it creates a loop, or to use a phrase from 19th century German biblical scholarships, a hermeneutical circle. We don't need to get into that.
We can skip that.
Well, but bringing up science is I think a nice transition point for the next thing that we need to mention, which is that in the last video we lifted up the persecution of Galileo as being an important point in the master narrative that leads to our secular age. But it's one of those stories, like the story of everybody believing that the earth was flat until Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, that simply isn't true, right? Galileo wasn't truly persecuted. It is true that at a point, his writing becomes banned by the Pope and by the Magisteria. And I think maybe he is basically told, you've got to kind of, it's not house arrest, but his ability to travel was limited.
Yeah.
That's about the extent of it. That's not the same thing as, say, martyrdom,
Right.
or whatever. And every historian who has really looked into what happened will tell you that the ban had more to do with the personal relationship between Galileo and the Pope at the time, and the way that Galileo presented himself and presented his findings. It's not as if the heliocentric view of the universe was brand new, right? Copernicus had put it forward without any kind of resistance. Before Copernicus, Nicholas of Cusa, who worked for the church, who was a theologian, but also studied in mathematics, had used math, not astronomy, to make the argument that the sun, even before Nicholas Copernicus, Nicholas of Cusa had made that argument, the heliocentric argument. The sun must be at the center, not the earth. No problem there. It really had to do with Galileo's own kind of presentation of his findings and his own kind of personality and relationship.
Right, as you pointed out, I mean, the church and politics is deeply interconnected now, and maybe that's always the case to some degree. There's always politics in any kind of human institution, and certainly there was politics in the papacy, as we all know. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning too, Nick, is that the geocentric model, right, with the Earth at the center of our solar system, was not an especially Christian or religious worldview. It was just the dominant way that humans understood, or in the Latin West, understood the world, based on Aristotelian physics. And it made some sense. It had an elaborate system of epicycles and all this stuff. It made some sense to account for movements, but then there were problems that emerged, and a kind of new framework had to emerge. But that really wasn't a religious question so much. It was just it was a question to kind of understand what's going on astronomically out there. Sometimes this is presented, though, as though the church was the one pushing the geocentric view, against all reason or something. And that's definitely a distortion. This really isn't a religious question fundamentally.
That's right. And the resistance to the heliocentric view of the universe, the resistance, as you point out, doesn't come from an appeal to Genesis.
Right.
It came from an appeal to the Ptolemaic view of the universe.
Yeah.
Ptolemy being a pagan philosopher who had come up with, using Aristotle and others, had come up with this description of the universe that saw the earth at the center. I actually wear a watch that is, I don't know if you can see it here, that it's the Ptolemaic system of the universe. So the earth is at the center, and you see the sun and the moon are going around. As the sun is the minute hand, the moon is the hour hand, and then the stars, which keep turning around the earth.
I see. Yeah.
And anyway, so that was the view that had been held since late antiquity.
That's right. Yeah.
By Christians, by Jews, by Muslims, by pagans, everybody, because it was, as an explanatory model, it was very good, except for some things that it had trouble explaining, certain planets and so on.
Which is simply how scientific models develop. They're a good working model for a while, and then you discover, some data doesn't really fit into this anymore, and it may be that you kind of keep tweaking the model, but you might get to a point where you simply have to scratch the model and come up with a new one, and a new way of looking at things. And this is not so foreign to us, because this sort of thing has actually happened in the 20th century with gravity, and I think in some ways how we think about particles even. Our views on that have changed quite radically. So this is just the normal procession of human intellectual thought as we try to make sense of the material world.
Right. I mean, the book that, of course, everybody lifts up, and rightly so, is the one by Thomas Kuhn.
Right. Right.
Remind me of the name.
Structures of Scientific Revolutions, I think, or
Yeah,
something.
that's it. Yeah. And so, and that's precisely what this book says, is that,
Right.
that you have these scientific models that eventually you work on them, but at some point, in some cases, they just need to be replaced. And there's
Right.
always resistance.
Always,
There's
yeah.
always resistance to scrapping an old model in favor of a new. There was resistance to the models that emerged from Einstein's special and general theories of relativity. Indeed, his teacher from school, who thought he was a poor student, Minkowski, did the geometry that's now known as space-time geometry, and said, well, if Einstein's right, then space-time is a four-dimensional reality, and this is now sometimes referred to as the block universe. And even Einstein said, "Ooh, I don't know about that." And then Einstein had to kind of come around and say, okay, yes, that is the natural conclusion that you would draw. That's the model you would create if my theories are correct. And even now there are models that are still being clung to, despite the fact that they don't seem to be panning out in terms of their explanatory power, but because this is just the nature of things. We're always conservative, we being people. I mean, we're, scientists or not, are always conservative about the models by which we understand reality.
Right.
And that was true in the 17th century, and it's true now. And that's really what's at the heart of the resistance to Galileo, was that heliocentric model, and what Galileo added to that through his astronomical observations, that needed to prove itself. It was
Right.
still new.
Right.
And
Right.
it needed to show that it could work as an explanatory model better than the Ptolemaic system. And that's just, as we said, that's the nature of the structure of scientific revolution.
Right. And I think last time I mentioned, I think it was last time, or maybe it was the first video, but the quote from Bertrand Russell in his book Religion and Science. And that, of course, presents religion as always the enemy, always the opponent of science. But I think one of the things that's really important for people to know, Nick, is that these early scientists that we're talking about here, in early modernity, Galileo and Newton for sure, and Leibniz and others, these were faithful, devout Christians who were scientists because of their Christianity. And what I mean by that is that their understanding of the world was that it was God's creation. Nature is God's creation. And as a result, it must, in some sense, bear the imprints of the creator. And one of those imprints would be order and structure and intelligibility, right? And so this then becomes a motivation for doing science. We're going to go look at nature. We're going to study its order, its regularity, and that, in a way, this is a window into the mind of the creator. So in a sense, then, science itself, the modern scientific period, was driven by a kind of religious impulse to understand God and God's creation more deeply. And I still think it's an interesting question, and one that I think about a lot. Why does the universe make sense? Why is it orderly? Why is it that you can explain it with simple laws that you can express in mathematical language? Why is it rational and orderly? I think that's the same sort of question people like Newton and Galileo, for them, they would have just simply said, well, this is because it's created by God. And I think there's something still compelling about that, frankly. Scientists don't ask that question maybe in their everyday work now. They don't think about, like, why does it all make sense? Why do these theories have explanatory power? But that's a philosophical question, I think, that's still lurking out there that demands attention.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, we said we wouldn't get into this in our last video, but I'll say really quickly, St. Thomas Aquinas had made a distinction between what he referred to as natural grace, which is just the grace that is creation itself, right? Because none of this has to exist from a theological perspective, right? God alone is the one who it is his very nature to exist, or as someone like Aquinas would say, his essence is his
Right.
existence. It's his nature to exist. Nothing about this world or about us is like that. I mean, I could have not been born if my parents had not gotten together. It's a simple twist of fate, as Bob Dylan might say, and I would have never been born, and the world would have gone on, despite what I want to believe,
much,
the world would have gone.
more impoverished, Nick, if you were not with us.
Nobody would notice, right?
But your existence is
despite-
contingent as opposed to necessary. Yeah, right.
That's right. That's right. And that's true of everything in the universe. And there's no reason to think, though some scientists make a metaphysical claim that the universe must exist because it's its nature to exist. That's actually, in Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, that's essentially what he argues, right? And he presents that as why there's no need for God. But that's a metaphysical claim. It's not a scientific claim. And there's no reason, I think, metaphysically to say that. If everything that constitutes the universe, or if we have a multiverse, the multiverse, everything that constitutes it is contingent.
Right.
I think it's much more likely then that the whole thing is contingent. And if that's the case, then it must be contingent upon some being that's necessary, and that being we call God, as Thomas would say.
Right.
But the point here is that all things that exist, therefore, exist as God's good creation, and which is just what Genesis 1 says. That God calls into being these things. He brings them creatio ex nihilo, out of nothing, and therefore, to say that is to say that God's grace suffuses everything, but this is a natural grace. And then he talked about how on top of that, God gives us yet more grace, the grace that saves us in the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ, given to us through the sacraments. And so this is a supernatural grace, right? It's more than just the natural grace of existence. And what happens is those early natural philosophers, who are Christians, that we might anachronistically call scientists now, like Newton, like Leibniz, what they're saying is, well, if all of creation is a good gift from God, then let us rejoice in and explore and probe the depths of these blessings, of this good gift from God.
Right.
That's their motivation, even up until when you see someone like Jonathan Edwards in colonial America. We all think of him as the guy who wrote "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," which was a sermon he wrote and then preached and decided he hated it and would never preach it again. But that's what he's remembered for.
We've all been there.
What he really enjoyed writing about was the natural world. I mean, he would just go out and explore, and that, that's part of how he described the spider being suspended, was because he had spent so much time glorying in the natural world and looking at spiders and that kind of thing. So I think that's an important point. Another point that we'll have to mention in the next video is how, in addition to being Christians who took their faith seriously. Most of these natural philosophers were also engaged in things that might be called magic, or we might now call the occult, which they didn't see as in any way conflicting either with their faith or with their natural philosophy or their science, but they saw it all working together. And by magic, I mean things like alchemy, but even things like, you know, having spell books and that kind of stuff. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next video.
Yeah. Well, Nick, I think we've gone through the basics of the story, and we've told a different kind of story in a fair amount of detail. How would you summarize the narrative we've been telling today in, let's say, I'll give you 2 minutes, okay? How would you do it in 2 minutes?
Oh, I was actually going to ask you to do that.
Oh, were you? Okay. I'd be happy to do it too if you want.
Do a better job.
Or instead. I mean, I think what I heard you saying in this video and what we've been talking about is that there isn't this dramatic break between late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Yes, there is the disintegration of urban centers and of certain kinds of Roman administrative structures, but learning continues. It's preserved in monasteries and eventually then in schools, cathedral schools, and it kind of finds its flowering in the high Middle Ages with universities, right? Which become the bedrock of modern learning, okay? That we still, of course, rely on. And that some of the issues that people bring up to highlight the barbarism of the Middle Ages, say the Crusades or the Inquisition, they're more complicated than people often realize. And there's not a simple sort of story we can tell. So it's difficult to describe the Middle Ages then as simply dark. But rather, it maybe has its dark spots, but it's got a lot of light too. So when we get to the quote unquote Renaissance, we're not really experiencing a real birth. We're experiencing a kind of flowing out from some very significant developments in the high Middle Ages. And the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment would not have happened had it not been for that continuous development in the Latin West. And that the work of science, which is so significant in modernity and in our secular age, is a kind of authority we regularly turn to, is in many ways a religious activity, or at least its original impulse was rooted in religion and theology and a kind of religious worldview. So what you see then is not this simple light, dark, light, but really light, and maybe some more light even, and maybe, you know, and so light kind of flowing throughout. It's a much more complicated picture, and not a picture of the church or religion as essentially hostile to enlightenment and progress and development, but in many ways the engine of those things.
Yeah,
Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. And so in the next video, we'll need to talk a little bit about you know, return to this topic that we mentioned in the first video about the creation of the concept of religion the way we use it now.
Yes.
And why that happened. And we'll need to address, well, if there wasn't this kind of these breaks of late antiquity and then the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages and then the Renaissance, and if that construal of history actually doesn't give us a very accurate picture,
Right.
then why is it that we now live in the secular age? And what then does it really mean to live in the secular age? Because it doesn't seem like it's what many people mean when they talk about secular.
Yeah.
So we'll revisit a lot of the questions that came up in that very first video as we say, maybe this map that we sketched out that felt right is actually not that right after all.
Right.
And maybe we need to start thinking about, and maybe in fact all around us people are starting to have a different sense of a different kind of map of the age that we're living in.
Right. Very good. Well, thank
All
you.
right.
Nick.
Thank you.
Enjoyed being with you once again, and look forward to being with you on Wednesday night for our Zoom conversation. And anyone watching this, if you'd like to join us for that, just put a notice in the comments and we'll get in touch with you.
And you're here in the stillness, near me, I sense holy sweetness, calling my soul, though it's restless and running, tired soul, though it's restless, till I find my rest in thee. And you're here in the stillness, near me, oh my holy sweetness, calling holy sweetness.